French Revolution Part 2, which is how French people say 3. In this video, we're going to talk about what was going on with everything outside of the palace just prior to the beginning of the French Revolution. So France is still in a feudal-like state at this time. But I say feudal-like because some things have been happening over the last couple of 100 years that had caused the emergence of a new class of people. So in a feudal society, you have pretty defined classes of peasantry and nobility, and there is like a layer of merchant class in there, but it's not necessarily significant. And frequently the merchant class were travelers, like they would travel with their goods, so they aren't necessarily even rooted in the community. And so in true feudal society, they're not a class that gets a lot of consideration. But as a result of colonialism and mercantilism, start to see the development of a stronger merchant class. Also, as a result of Renaissance and Reformation and Enlightenment and scientific revolution, you see the emergence of a class of what today we would call white-collar type of people, like attorneys and doctors. And so these are people who have more money than the peasantry, but they're not the super wealthy. We would call them upper middle class today, but in France, they're called the bourgeoisie, or the bourgeois, depending on your pronunciation. Another important thing to note here is that the merchant class, some of them were well educated, but some of them were not. They were just financially successful, and so they didn't necessarily fully embrace Enlightenment ideas, this merchant class, but they embraced that they were now able to make more money. Whereas the people that are becoming lawyers and doctors fancy themselves enlightened because they're educated. So in the more metropolitan areas like Paris, you have all of these educated, enlightened people meeting for coffee and having conversations about the Enlightenment principles of people like Rousseau, and also from other countries, Locke. And they're talking pretty actively amongst each other about what's going on in the US with these enlightened ideas that motivated the American Revolution. Meanwhile, the merchant class is also getting together and having conversations, but instead of talking about Enlightenment principles, they're more focused on how those guys in the colonies are finally doing something about those royal bastards putting all the taxes on them. The city centers, you also have the lower class, the peasant class, the laborers, and these are what we would look at as blue collar types of people, because we're not in a full industrial period yet, but we are in the throes of colonialism and mercantilism, and that has developed some of those blue collar jobs. A really big one in Paris was working the fish market, for instance, right? It's not agricultural, but it requires labor. And these people are poor, and they're tired of being taxed, and they're tired of not having any voice, and they're real grumpy. Outside of the city, we have mostly poor people, with the exception of big landowners who have worked their way into nobility or have been nobility for a long time. And again, these are people who, much like the blue collar workers, feel very put upon in terms of their labor and taxation. But I think an important thing to note about the people in the countryside is that, unlike today, where we have all these communication mechanisms to spread information and talk to each other, that didn't exist at any sort of huge scale. In fact, a lot of French people in parts of France didn't even speak French. So this is not like a united group of people behind a national cause. These are just laborers who are tired. So based on what I've just described, you can see here that there are a lot of different groups functioning with a lot of different political agendas. And that's going to be very important in the outcome of what happens once the revolution begins. Okay, that's it for this video. In my next video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the political and economic structure of France in a more generic sense. Kind of like explaining what their government setup is. And then we'll start getting into the really good stuff after that. See you soon.